Hello and welcome to today's video. Today's video is a question and answer video with the questions brought to me by students in my Introduction to Photography class at Highline College for fall quarter 2022. So this is going to be a little while, so sit back, relax, grab a beverage, get comfy, and get ready for some questions and some answers. First, some introduction thoughts before we begin with the questions. Thought number one for introduction is my most common answer will be, it depends. It depends because it's a lot like cooking. Photography is in that when the seasonings you use, salt and pepper, garlic, whatever, depends on what you're creating. It also depends in a big part, maybe even in a larger part, on your personal preferences, your personal taste. So in photography, some questions are best answered by it depends, and then figuring out what works best and what your preferences are in your situation. So that's introductory part one. Introductory part two is the fact that obviously these are my opinions based on my experiences and my personal preferences. So anytime you're asking questions on the internet or getting answers on the internet, my suggestion to you is to look for multiple sources. See what the common threads are, if there are any, to the answers to your questions. But as much as I would like to be the one and only source for all your photography questions and answers, I know that it's good to hear other voices. It's good to get other opinions because, again, I have my set of opinions and experiences which may not answer your question best. So, having said that, I do invite you, if you want to follow up on a question that's been asked or have an answer you'd like to contribute, please do that in the comments below. I'd really appreciate that. There's always stuff for me to learn, always stuff to share in the community based on more experiences than just one person. So, there you go. So let's get into the questions and rock and roll with that. So the questions are going to be broken into four categories. The first category is camera gear. The second category is camera settings and technique. The third is business of photography. And the fourth is miscellaneous stuff that didn't quite fit anywhere else. So let's get started with the first category, camera gear. So question number one in the camera gear category is, I feel like I'm announcing Jeopardy, sorry. Here's the question. The question is, what are a few budget-friendly, versatile, easy-to-use cameras for beginners? That's a great question. And of course, this is the first time I'm going to answer with, it depends. Here's why it depends. The reason for that is there are so many options. And when you're looking at new cameras, I encourage you to think of two things. First, there are no bad cameras. Any camera you go out and buy, especially if it's new or made within the past few years, if you're buying something used, is going to be a really good camera. Technically, it's going to be great. The second thing to remember is there's no perfect cameras. No one camera is going to do everything you want, even if you spent almost all the money in the world. It just doesn't exist. So with those expectations managed and kept in mind, my suggestion would be for a good entry-level camera would be a mirrorless camera for one. So I wouldn't recommend buying a DSLR anymore. A digital single lens reflex, a camera with a mirror. And the main reason for that is nobody's making them anymore. No new cameras are coming out that are DSLRs. All the new cameras are mirrorless. So eventually those cameras are going to go away. And the second reason I really like mirrorless cameras, and part of the answer to that question was versatility, is mirrorless cameras are really, really good at video. So if you like to do video and photo, and video is part of our modern photography life oftentimes, or our sharing life anyway. So having that capability in a mirrorless camera is really good. Now, specifically, cameras I might recommend are going to be the Sony EVZ-V10, I think it is. That's about $800, but that's about the entry price for a brand new camera. There's also some entry-level mirrorless cameras right around $1,000 from both Canon and Nikon, so you might look at those as well. For students in Art 147, I will send you a link a list of all the cameras that get you started in mirrorless camera land, and so that'll be a helpful resource to you all. Do some research as you're looking at cameras. Look at YouTube camera reviews, look at online reviews from whatever place you're looking at potentially buying the camera. My recommendation on buying a camera is to buy a camera from, if possible, a local camera store. In the Seattle area, we have two. We have Glazer's Camera in North Seattle, and we have Kenmore Camera up in Bothell. If you're going to buy online, my recommendation is to go to buy from a camera store, not from the generic online retailers, and because they will help you, they will be a resource to you both in selecting a camera potentially, as well as if you need any help with support or problems. So there you go. It depends on which camera to get. There's lots of them. They're all really good. Even a used camera is probably a really good option these days for something maybe a few years old if your budget is more limited. I'm having a Nikon D3400. Which prime lens is better, 35mm or 50mm f1.8? A very specific question. Again, I'm going to use the answer, it depends. 35mm is going to be a little bit wider angle lens, so if you like more establishing photos with more context of the scene, that's a good lens. The 50mm is going to be a little narrower, a short telephoto on a Nikon D3400, so you're going to get less of a field of view, so a little more of this than this. It's a personal preference. Both great lenses. If when in doubt, if you can afford it, get both. Then you have a couple options, and it's always good to have options. Next gear question is, what is a good camera to take photos of the moon with? This is a technical question because there's a lot of technique in a way involved in creating photos of the moon. One of the suggestions I would have for this, not a specific camera, but the newer the camera, the better. Newer cameras will do better in those low light situations as far as amplifying the light. The other thing in regards to newer cameras is they tend to be higher resolution, also higher dynamic range, so the ability to get all the details of the moon. The main thing, though, with creating photos of the moon that you need is the lens. You need a lens that's going to reach out and get you closer to the moon. You need a lens with at least 300mm focal length. 400, 600 is even better. So those lenses are getting pretty big. They're getting pretty expensive. They're getting pretty heavy. So in considering photos of the moon, one of the things you have to factor in is how often will you do it? Is it worth the investment? Most of the modern cameras will do a good job technically of photos of the moon. Again, the part that's going to be your limiting factor is the lens and how much reach you get and how close and how big the moon can get in the frame. So you're going to have to factor that into your decision. There's another question coming up later about how to do night photography, and I'll answer a couple other things you're going to need relative to that in a minute. The next question is, what is a good technique for taking good photos of close-up and macro details? So when you're up close to your subject, a couple things to keep in mind. Every lens is going to have a minimum focusing distance depending on the lens. That's anywhere from probably 6 to 8 inches to a couple of feet. So unless it's a specialized lens for getting close, which is called a macro lens, you won't be able to get physically close to your subject. Techniques when you are close to your subject, one of the things that's going to happen is any movement, any little movement of the camera, because you are so close and magnified, the camera movement will also be magnified. So tripods are really good for that. Another technique that's really good for being close and minimizing movement is using a relatively fast shutter speed, somewhere at least 1/125 of a second, or 1/250, 1/500 if you can. So those are what you have to freeze the motion, any motion of the camera, potentially any motion from wind in your subject or movement. You want to minimize that with shutter speed. So having the camera still and not moving, that's going to be super important when you're up close to your subject. One way to get closer to your subject without investing in a specialized macro lens, and this is for cameras, not phones so much, is they're called extension tubes, these guys. And what they do is they go on the back of your lens, and then your lens connects to your camera, and this turns any lens into a close focus lens. How close depends on the lens and what focal length you're using. But the lenses I use this with, I can get to within usually about 2 inches of my subject and get really close. The subject gets larger in the frame. But when you're that close to your subject, you really have to pay attention to any movement you might be doing with the camera so you lose sharpness in the photo, or any subject movement from maybe a breeze or something like that. So pay attention to those kind of things. Use fast shutter speed, maybe a tripod. That'll help you get sharp photos when you're up close to your subject. Next question is, do you always need to use a professional camera in order to be a good photographer, or an iPhone camera works well too? So to answer this question, I want to concentrate on that phrase, good photographer. And my answer will be no, you don't need a professional camera, an expensive camera, a camera. You can use your phone. A phone will be a great technical and creative camera. Also, because it's with you all the time, it's going to be more likely to be used. So when you see something that looks like it could be an interesting photo, get your phone out and go create an interesting photo. One of the fun things with phones is they have gotten, especially in the past 2-3 years, they've gotten so technically good at creating photos that there's not a lot of reason not to use this to create a photo. There are certain situations though where a phone won't work as well as a camera, and one of those is lower light situations. Another is when subjects are hard to focus on, so fast moving subjects. Phones aren't quite as good at that as some of the more modern cameras are, but it's a price difference. It's a budget thing. It's how important is having a dedicated camera to you versus what you can do with your phone. So if you're being frustrated by your phone and what you can or can't do with your phone, then I think that's a good time to think about getting a camera so you can create the kind of photos you want. So that's my thought on that. I know lots of people, and myself included, we can all make really great technical photos and creative photos with these phones. So no, you don't need a camera to be a good photographer. Next category is photography business. So some questions on how do you make money at this? So here's question number one. Question number one, do you need to go to college to be a professional photographer? And this answer is not going to be one of those it depends questions. This one I have a very strong opinion on. So here's my opinion on that. No. I don't think you need to go to college to be a professional photographer, to be a good photographer, to be a creative photographer, to create interesting photos. But it's probably a really good idea to go to college to do some formal education and tailor it around what you want to do as a creative person. And here's what I mean by that. So I wouldn't recommend going to a specialized college to learn photography, but I would recommend going to a college and getting your general education. That piece of paper gives you lots more options. And while you're then at college, pursue the business side of things. Pursue marketing classes, accounting classes, general business classes, writing classes, because a big part of creating a photography business is all that stuff. Is marketing, is writing, is accounting, is the back end stuff that allows you to have opportunities to connect with people to do the photography. So I'd recommend yes to college if it's a good fit for your life and timing, and then concentrate on maybe the business classes and or pay attention to art history type classes, other creative type classes that will help you in rounding out your visual experiences and expertise. So no to a specialized photography degree, but yes to college in general. It just gives you potentially at least more options, although even that is changing a little bit. So it depends, I guess. Next question about professional and photography business is, what are some ways and platforms to start making money off my photos? So there's lots of ways to make money off your photos. One of the ways you can do it, that your photos are out there and available 24/7, is called stock photography. Stock photography is where you have a photo and then you license it out to other places where they can sell it. You're not going to probably make a lot of money in that unless you specialize. That's a whole other question and topic. My suggestion is do a YouTube search or online search for how to be a stock photographer. There's lots of information about how to do that, lots of different ways to do it, but that's a potential option. Another way to make money as a photographer would be to sell your photos directly. So maybe you have an online store with your pictures of flowers and landscapes and things like that, where people can buy them directly from you. There's different ways to do that. You might print your own photos and mail them out yourself, which gives you the most control and portion of the profit, but there's more work in that. Or you might use a number of online services that will you upload your digital photo and they will take care of printing, shipping, all the processing of credit cards and things like that, and it's done for you. So that's a couple ways to get started with selling photos you already have. One of the great things about you selling your own photos either through stock or by yourself is they're always out there. You do it once and they're ready to go anytime someone wants to buy it. The harder part is then reaching the audience that wants your photos, having enough of those photos that are of the quality and type that people want, learning how to do that whole process. So it's a business in and of itself, learning how to do that. But lots of photographers do it. I have some photos people can buy and they occasionally buy, but I haven't put as much effort into it, so it hasn't been as successful. Because there's all the things that we have to do. So find it, it's like anything. The more attention you can dedicate to a specialty, a skill, more chance you have of success at that. So if that kind of photography sounds interesting to you, again, I'd recommend doing some research about it, investing lots of time and energy into it, and being consistent and persistent at that. Next question is, how did you start your photography business? Hard to have a photography business due to all the competition. And the answer to that one is, how did I start? We'll start there with that question. I started by just telling people I'm a photographer. And part of the way I did that was I had a graphic design business first. And as part of that, I would offer to take photos if they work for a project. And then that kind of evolved more into being the main thing I do, which is now photography. Is it hard with all the competition? Yes. There is tons and tons of competition for photography. And the reason for that is the barrier to entry is pretty low. Almost anybody can say they're a photographer. Well, actually anybody can. And then you're a professional the minute someone pays you. So there's no specific licensing as far as being a licensed photographer. You do need a business license, but it's pretty easy to do that. In the midst of all that competition, how do you do a photography business? And that one is another, it depends. Lean into what you are good at, examine what that is, lean into and examine what you enjoy doing as a photographer, and being aware of those things. Then it's simply, which is the hardest part, is getting the word out, letting people know what you do, having all the ways that people can contact you through a website, social media, maybe YouTube, going to meetings, networking with people, letting people know. Yeah, it's simple, but extremely complicated and sometimes frustrating to grow the business in the midst of all the other people doing this. But here's the thing to remember in the midst of that. The most powerful thing you have is you. You are different than everybody else, and for some people, you're going to be the best photographer for them. So by leaning into your personality, your strengths, who you are as a human being, and the kind of work you deliver and produce, that will be your greatest asset, and no one else can do that. Literally no one else can do what you do with a camera the way you do it. So lean into that, be aware of that, and know that there's still room for you in the photography business world. And if you have more specific questions about how to get started with that, I'd be glad to answer. And obviously, there's a whole lot of information there on the internet and YouTube. Next business type question is, if I wanted to start a business on the side taking family portraits, where do I start? Related to that previous question is where you start. My suggestion would be get a business license. In Washington State, it's pretty easy. Just search online Washington State business license. You'll need two, one for the state, one for the city you live in. It's about I think a 20-minute process to enter your details. The state license, I think, is $35 or $50 these days. And then your city will depend anywhere from like $25 to maybe $150. So start there with being legal and all that. The second thing you need to do is let people know that's what you do. It's really that simple and also that complicated. How do you tell people what you do? There's word of mouth, so you tell your friends and family what you do and have them encourage them to tell their friends and family that that's what you do. Again, another way to do this is to be active in your local community. Another way to do this is when you're face to face with people in groups. If you're in a classroom, let them know you do family photos. If you're in a business setting, let them know you do family photos. When you're online, on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, on the TikTok, on the whatever, I said the TikTok, sorry, all the places you might have an online presence, let people know what you do. So let people know. If you build it, they might come. But then it's a matter of producing the photos and doing the things you like and enjoy doing. So hopefully that creates a nice momentum of people who have enjoyed what you do and know about it. And now we'll tell more people about it, who tell more people. And then it gets bigger, 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 bigger. And all of a sudden you're doing it maybe full time if you want, or you at least have that option. That's the easy answer, but it's not the short answer. As you might imagine, that process takes a while. How long it takes is different for everybody. And that it even will work depends on all sorts of factors, including a little bit of luck or maybe a lot of luck. So hope that's helpful. And if you need some more specifics, again, leave a comment below with maybe your specific situation or specific suggestions you'd like. Next question is, are there internships to get into the photography business? And that answer is a little bit of a yes and no. I imagine there are some. I'm not currently aware of any. One thing I would recommend if you are looking for an internship is don't do it for free. Someone's going to benefit from what you're doing. You're helping them. Obviously, you're gaining something as well, but you may not make a living wage. But don't do an internship for free. That's kind of not good for you, and it doesn't value the work you're doing. Secondly, as far as internships or maybe assistantships or things like that, is talk to local photographers, see if you can accompany them on a photo session and see how they work. Maybe all you're doing is carrying bags and setting up lights, or just watching and paying attention to details. My experience is a lot of photographers I've met are super interested in helping the next generation. Again, knowing that there's room for lots of folks here. And so it doesn't hurt to ask. Maybe you accompany on one photo shoot. Maybe you do an informational type interview where you sit down and talk with them about some of these questions that are being asked here. How does your specific situation work? Again, my experience is most photographers are really happy to share that information. There's really no secrets anymore. We're all doing the same thing in a lot of ways with the same tools. So there's no need for secrecy necessarily around that anymore. But unfortunately, the downside is if you want to be a specific kind of photographer, it might be harder to find someone who's got a schedule that permits and/or it is in a location that is accessible to you where you can learn that type of photography directly from someone who's already doing it. But it doesn't hurt to ask. It doesn't hurt to research and find out. So that's my recommendation, is to find a photographer who's maybe doing work that you admire and enjoy, and start a conversation with them and see where that goes. It certainly doesn't hurt, and that would be the place I would start if I was looking to do something like that. Next question is, what's a good rate to charge people when you first start to be a photographer for people? My answer to that is going to be, it depends. The reason for that is that it depends quite a bit on a couple of factors. One factor is where you live. The Seattle area is more expensive than Laurel, Mississippi. I only know the name of that town because it's a TV show I watch on HGTV, and their houses are quite a bit less expensive there than they are in the Seattle area where I live. So I'm assuming photography would be less expensive there as well. So that's one factor. Another factor is a little bit your experience. Usually people are not willing to pay as much for someone who's just getting started because you don't have a body of work you can show them that says, yes, I know what I'm doing. Another factor is who you're working with. And here's what I mean by that. For example, a wedding photography session is quite a bit more than maybe family portraits on a hourly or how much work it takes basis, because a wedding is a once in a lifetime, hopefully, event, or at least that specific day is only happening at that given time, and there's really no do-overs. So there's more risk, more stress for everybody involved, which makes it have a higher value, which you can potentially charge more money for. So the way I set my prices was, when I was originally setting them, was I went online and did some research for photographers in my region, my area, so Sammamish, Washington. So I did Sammamish wedding photographer, and most photographers list their prices. So I went on there and found out the different pricings, the different rates they were charging. And then from that, what I did is I kind of went in the middle. So I didn't go to the lowest. There's always going to be someone less expensive than you. And I didn't go to the highest because I think it's a crazy price. So I kind of went in the middle. The other, and that was how I set my price. Another thing to consider as you're setting your prices is this simple fact. Don't price what you would pay for it. Don't price it at, oh, this is what I would pay, because you're not the customer. The people who want your photos are your customer, want photos that you're making of them. So keep that in mind. It's what I usually, if when in doubt, whatever price you're thinking in your brain as a starting point, double it. See what happens. You can always negotiate down if you have to or feel okay with it, but it's hard to say, oh, I really meant to say this price that's twice as much. You can't do that as well, at least in my experience. So pricing is tricky. It's complicated. Usually the way most people start is they start at a relatively low price, and then through the years, as they gain more experience and have more knowledge, they'll raise their prices. That's what I've done through the years, and I hope that's a little helpful. It's non-specific, but I guess in a nutshell, I would say do some research, find what the market in your area is, maybe go in the middle, or if you're just getting started, a little below the middle, and then see how that works, and then have conversations with people. And in your conversations with people, find out what works best for the kind of folks you want to create photos with. Next question is, what can I do to get more clients in the photography business? If you know the answer to this, I'd be glad to hear it, because that's something I'm still working on and will probably work on for as long as I do photography. One thing to note, and full disclosure here, is I've never been a full-time photographer, and that's been my only source of income. I'm a photography teacher, and that's my main source of income. I do photography projects as kind of a part-time thing on top of that, and obviously this YouTube channel. So I've never cracked the mystery of this, of how to get enough clients to be successful as a full-time photographer. So with that in mind, here's my answer. My answer is use all the resources you have available, and there's so many of them now. Obviously social media, an online web presence, maybe a YouTube channel where you become a resource of information. The simple answer is, but it's complicated, is to basically let people know you're a photographer. Let people know this is what you do and you like to work with them, and here's why they should work with you. One experience that kind of exemplifies that for me is one time I was at a Starbucks and I had my camera on the table while I was drinking my hot chocolate, and a gentleman came up to me and said, "Are you a photographer?" I said, "Yes." He next asked, "Do you do headshot photography?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, would you do mine?" And I said, "Yes." I mean, it was a little more complicated than that, but I got a photography project out of being at a Starbucks with my camera on the table. So that started a conversation, and we went from there. So let people know. Let people know in all the ways that you are out there in the world, face to face. Attend meetings where people are looking for photographers, maybe some business networking, Chamber of Commerce. While you're at college, if that's where you're at, let your classmates know that's what you do. Build a portfolio of work, of type of photos you want to create more of. So if you want to do model type photography or glamour type photography, get your friends and families to let you do photos with them to get started. And then you have stuff you can show people so that Now you're that kind of photographer. So let people know, be consistent and persistent in getting the word out. You can't just do it once. It's really tempting to think, well, once I create this thing and let people know, then I can just sit back and wait for the phone calls and emails and the text messages and DMs. And that's not how it works. You have to be continually promoting and getting the word out about what you're doing if you want to do it more. So the answer is be consistent, be persistent in telling people, hey, I'm a photographer and I'd love to work with you if that's the person you'd love to work with. Next question about photography business is, what are the trends in the photography business? Since everyone has phone nowadays, has the demand decreased? And I think the answer is yes and no. Yes and no. Somewhat the demand hasn't decreased, but what's changed is maybe the value people place on photography, because hey, I could maybe do that with my phone. And yes, you maybe could do that. Ooh, let me take a picture of the food I'm going to put on my menu in my new restaurant with my phone, but it's not going to look as good because that's kind of a highly technical type of photo, usually in lower light, that this type of camera with some really good lights, like hopefully I have in here, will do a more technically pleasing and aesthetically pleasing photo than this will do. But people don't know that because they're usually taking photos with their phones and they're happy with them because they're looking at them on this little screen, which hides all the things that aren't so great about phone photos. So in some senses, yes, demand for people with this type of camera is harder to explain and maybe justify. But the demand is not, I don't think, decreasing. People want more and more photos, if anything, than before. I don't have a real good answer from lots of experience or exposure to what the trends are in photography, but I kind of see two things going on. And it's two kind of extremes of on the continuum. And the continuum is, on one side, trendy. So doing the thing everybody else is doing that's popular for right now. And then this other end of the spectrum is authentic, doing the thing that's uniquely me that really no one else can do or even really wants to do, but people still enjoy it. So that's what I've noticed, is there's lots of the same on one end, people doing the same TikTok dances, doing the same kind of memes, if you will. And then on the other end are these really unique things that people are creating that you're like, oh my gosh, I've never seen that before. And so I'm really interested in that because I've never seen it before. There's risks on both ends, obviously. In some ways, it might be a little easier to be on the trendy end because it's safe there and it's worked at least a little while, but eventually that stops working. On the riskier end of being authentic and unique, the risk there is no one may get it or may take a while for people to get it. But the benefit is, if it's something you're creating that's important and unique to you, then it's easier to create it because it's something you really enjoy and it's something you almost have to create. So find out where you kind of live on that spectrum, that continuum of maybe trendy to authentic, and see what maybe if you're in the middle or towards one end or the other, and see what works best for you. Again, that's where your unique experiences, your unique preferences, your uniqueness as a human being will inform that decision of where you want to be here. So be you, because no one else is. So that's be my suggestion of a trend to follow. The next question is, what career pathways are in photography besides having a business of your own? And the answer is not many. Unfortunately, most photography jobs where you get a paycheck and you're employed by one specific company to do photography, they're mostly gone. Most photographers work freelance. Even famous photographers who do it full time, most, that have maybe been published in Vogue or other magazines where photography is an essential part of the magazine, they work freelance. They're hired on a one project basis, and they're not 100% sure where the next project's coming from. Sports Illustrated does that for their photographers. Many news stations and places that use photography a lot, also they hire freelance photographers. So maybe it's an ongoing basis, but it's not guaranteed. So there's not a lot of pathways directly to employment as a full-time photographer with ABC company or XYZ company anymore. So you're probably working for yourself. That's why I recommended when the question was about going to college for photography. That's why I recommended the business classes, the marketing classes, because you're probably going to be doing this on your own and having to get the word out and write about yourself and all those things that go into creating potential for success in a photography business. Next category is camera settings and techniques. So buttons, knobs, and dials, all those things on your camera. What do I do? How do I use them? So first question is, are there any other routines I can do to improve my photography? My best suggestion for this, as far as a technique, would be to go out and make lots of photos regularly, consistently. If there's specific things you would like to learn, do research about that on YouTube, on the internet, or take a class for it like this, or there's lots of specialized photography classes where if you want to learn something, you can do it. So it's having a vision for what you want to do and then being consistent and persistent in following it. There's really no shortcuts for most of us to improving the skills besides having a camera in hand, whether it's your phone or a camera, and going out and creating photos of things that you enjoy. It just takes time. The more you do it, the more you'll learn about yourself and the way you like to create photos. And then you'll find things you don't like. So maybe you do less of those. And then you can lean in more directly into the things you do enjoy. And then you keep fine tuning that thing that you enjoy until you're doing more of that. You're doing it consistently on an ongoing basis. So the technique answer to this one, I guess, is time. Investing time and energy in the practice of learning the photography and creating photos, as well as if there's skills you want to learn more about, doing some either online or other research to find those ways to learn those skills. Next question is, for street photography, what mode would be the best to shoot in? I'm going to say on this one, it depends. The reason for that is, personally, I shoot in manual mode, so I'm controlling aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Most of the time that works really well for me. The main reason that works for me is it reduces the amount of exposure surprises. And I've gotten used to it, so I'm fast with it. But I think for most people, I would recommend probably aperture priority, in some cases shutter priority. Okay, so here's which one do you choose? If what's important in the photo is what's in focus, then you do aperture priority. If what's important in the photo is motion, so you either want to freeze it or pause the motion, or if you want to accentuate the motion and maybe make it blurry, then you would do shutter priority. What the advantage of that is the camera is going to do the exposure math, so it can respond quickly, faster than I can even in manual mode, when you move from one amount of light to another and you don't have time to change the buttons and dials, and then you might miss the moment. So especially when you're first getting started, when you're getting comfortable with your camera and doing this type of photography, either aperture or shutter priority would be my recommendation. Yeah, that's a good place to start. And for lots and lots of folks, that works really, really well. Next question is, to get more interesting photos, what are some good places to take photos? My answer to that's going to be a little bit, it depends. I think one of the factors that goes into creating interesting photos is there are things that you find interesting. So if you like nature, go into nature places. In the Seattle area, there's lots of botanical gardens, there's lots of parks, there's lots of waterfront, lots of places you can go create photos in nature without even going very far. And if you want to go a little farther, we have lots of places within an hour drive of the Seattle area that have lots of interesting nature. If you like more urban type things, again, in the Seattle area and lots of cities, you have many, many options there. For example, if you want to go to Seattle, Pike Place Market is a great place to go. The downtown branch of the Seattle Public Library is an amazingly interesting architecture place. So if you like architecture, big cities are good for that. So my thought in answer to this question would be aware of what you find interesting, and then in your local vicinity, find places that best feed that and start there. If you don't like architecture, going to a city and doing architecture photos, while I may enjoy that, may not be interesting to you. So it's going to be harder and more complicated for you to create interesting photos in there because you don't enjoy it. So I hope that makes sense. Next question for techniques and such is, what is a great mindset to have when you're out taking photos? I really, really like this question. One great mindset to have is, well, here's the mindset I use. I do planned spontaneity. So I have an idea of what I want to do. So for example, if I go to downtown Bellevue, I might be thinking, "Ooh, I'm going to go this route and look at this building and see what's going on." But in the midst of that, that's my overall plan. In the midst of that, I want to be open, be spontaneous to unexpected surprises of photo opportunities that I can go ahead and make photos with. So, for example, there might be someone walking down the street that's got interesting clothes, or maybe an interesting car drive by. It wasn't in my plan, but let's make a photo of it because it looks interesting in this situation. So, being open to possibilities, but also having at least a loose plan of what you want to do. That's my suggestion for how to do that. Next question is, do you have any tips on how to improve your photography other than practice, other than time? And the answer to that is yes, I do have some ideas. Some tips I would suggest would be to become inspired. So, how do you get inspired? Look at other people who are creating stuff that you might like to create and be as specific as possible. So, here's what I mean by that. If you want to do architecture photography or bird photography or nature photography, be specific about what you would like to do. So if it's architecture, maybe you want to do high rise, or you want to do Gothic architecture, and do some Google image search to see what other people are doing. Go to YouTube, see if there's a YouTube channel that does that kind of thing, and see what other people are doing so that you can get some ideas and concepts that might help you, as well as techniques to get you thinking about how you might go about do that in your own photography. So finding people who are already doing what you would like to do, and then following along and learning from them, because most of us who are doing those things are sharing it on either social media, YouTube, or our website. So find out what other people are doing and learn from them, be inspired by them, and then go do your own thing. Next question is kind of a technical one. Are there any disadvantages to shooting widest possible aperture besides shallow depth of field? And the answer is sometimes. Sometimes. When your camera is open at its widest aperture, the largest opening, which lets in the most amount of light and has the least amount of the image in focus, sometimes what happens is, depending on how the lens is manufactured and designed, you will also get what's called vignetting. So you'll get darkening of the corners at that wider aperture. Some people like that personality of a lens, and some people don't. So that's one thing that sometimes happens. Another thing that often happens in very wide aperture lenses is the corners, in addition to maybe being darker with the vignetting, will maybe not be as sharp. So again, some people notice it, some people it bothers them. So your mileage will vary on that as far as how important that is to you. So that's a couple of things that might happen technically when you're creating photos at the largest aperture on your lens, the largest lens opening. The next question is, are you usually considering exposure triangle when shooting? I usually shoot on aperture priority and don't think too much about other settings unless a photo turns out blurry or grainy. So exposure triangle, we need to talk about what that is. They've mentioned in this question about aperture. So the other two parts of the exposure triangle are shutter speed and ISO. Personally, this is my pet peeve, my personal preference and idiosyncrasy is I don't like the phrase exposure triangle. Because it doesn't suggest the relationship of how these things work together. So for my preference, I prefer the exposure recipe. That's the phrase I prefer to use. One, because I like eating, and two, I think it's a way we can connect to how these three controls work: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Think of cooking. When you're cooking, the taste will change, even though you're using the same ingredients. Maybe you're using salt, pepper, garlic, but the taste will change depending on how much you use of each of those things. So similarly, with aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, while that creates exposure, how much of each of those you use will change how the photo looks. So for example, with Shutter speed controls the appearance of motion, so you might have a photo that's sharp or a photo that's blurry because of shutter speed. Aperture controls what's in focus, so the background might be sharp or it might be blurry. And then light sensitivity is all about ISO, so as you're increasing sensitivity to light in lower light environments, you're going to get more noise, so you're going to reduce image quality through grain. So all those things, in addition to making the photo brighter and darker, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, they also affect another component of the photo that I don't think the exposure triangle reflects. So that's a long answer, sorry. So do I think of these things? Yes. Every photo I'm thinking about how do I want the motion rendered? Do I need to freeze the motion, or do I want blurry motion? I have some photos of welding, construction workers welding, and I wanted the sparks to kind of fly, so I had to change my shutter speed to do that. I wanted the background to be blurry, so I had to take into account that the aperture was at the largest opening I could get. And then I also wanted to amplify the light because it was kind of dark, so I had to turn up the ISO. So most photos, I'm thinking of all three of those things, and I've gotten better at it and fast at it because I've done enough of it. Do you need to? No, not necessarily. My wife, when she creates her photos, she's in pretty much full auto mode. She's in program mode. So she's letting the camera decide aperture, shutter speed, ISO most of the time. Sometimes she'll pick the aperture she wants. So there's lots of different ways to do this, but being aware and being intentional about how you want motion rendered, how you want the focus to be rendered. Do you want lots in focus or little? And then lastly, including, okay, how much light do I have and what will be the effect of turning up ISO to create the photo I want? You got to think of all three of them all the time, pretty much. The next couple of questions are related to low light or night photography. And this first one is any specific tips and being steady. So here's the answer. Depending on how dark it is and what kind of shutter speed you're working at, you'll need a tripod. You can't hold your camera still for probably more than 1/30th of a second. So any exposure that's longer duration than that, you're going to need a tripod or some way to hold your camera still. The other thing that also becomes a really big factor in that is your lens. You want a lens that's going to let in a lot of light if you're trying to do astrophotography or Milky Way type photography, where you want and need to capture as much light as you can from the lens before it gets to turning up the ISO, which adds noise to the image. So again, there's that exposure triangle, thinking of all the factors. Light photography can be pretty technically demanding. The lenses you need are of a certain type and quality, and they're relatively expensive. You want a camera that performs well when the ISOs get to higher numbers, so they're amplifying the light more. So all those things factor in when you're doing low light or especially night photography as an element to consider in whether it's even a good fit for you. Plus, the other thing is in night photography is you have to be willing to go back multiple times because the clouds may be out, the moon may be uncooperative. You need to go to places where there's not light pollution. So yeah, you can't necessarily just be in your backyard doing Milky Way photography on any given night. You have to go somewhere where that's going to work with a lens and a camera that will best be able to do that. I hope that makes sense. Next question is, how can I avoid distractions when I'm trying to solely focus on one thing? And that's a really, really, I think, interesting question. The reason I like that is because what can take a photo from oh my goodness to is those little things like, what is that doing over there? What's that little thing? What's that little blob? Is paying attention to all those things. And my suggestion for learning how to do that is time. There's really no substitute for that. Learning to see through a camera, whether you're looking through the screen of your phone or whether you're looking through the viewfinder on a camera, you're taking this world where you have peripheral vision with your eyes, but your camera doesn't. So learning to see differently is really powerful, and the only way to do that in my experience, is with lots of time looking through the little box of your camera that looks at the world differently. Secondly, then, is being aware of the need to and the ability you have to not just, oh, I saw it from here, so let me hold up my camera and see what it looks like, but to move from where you noticed it to find how you're going to arrange all the elements in that little box in your camera. So you might need to move a little to the left, a little to the right, maybe get a little taller or get down lower. So being aware of all the layers in your photo is something that takes practice and time to do and to learn, so that you're noticing foreground and middle ground and background and learning how to arrange all the things in your photo in a way that works really, really well. I'm still learning it. I'm still really learning how to do that stuff, how to learn and see foreground well, middle, and the background, and align all those things in a pleasing way. So that's my journey. I hope that helps a little bit. Time and effort in learning to see like a camera does. That's what you have to do, is taking this 3D world with peripheral vision that you and I have into this 2D world that's just a box of a certain size and shape, and everything has to fit in that, and making all those elements work together. Next question is, how can software impact distractions? Can it make distractions less noticeable? And my answer to that is yes, it can. Most of the time, some of the time. There's a tool in Lightroom called the healing brush, and I call it the distraction removal tool. So I guess I kind of answered that question. However, it does depend on the type of distraction, what's around it, and whether the tool will be able to physically and technically remove it. So yes, there's tools that exist to help you with that. When at all possible, try and remove it through a different composition, or if you physically can remove it before you make the photo, do that. But there's great freedom in being able to create photos and know that in certain situations, in many situations, you can remove that distraction with software. So I use that quite frequently because I'm lazy, and plus sometimes I just physically can't move that thing out of the way because it's a mile away, or it's unmovable. So yes, software sometimes to the rescue, but when possible, get it the way you want before you click and make the photo. Next question is, what would be a good technique for creating pictures of basketball players in motion? Sports photography, action photography is again another kind of pretty technical photography, just as night photography is. So it's going to lean a little bit more into the technology that exists in your camera. You have a couple factors going on here. You have focusing speeds. Most basketball games take place indoors in relatively low light. So you need a camera that will perform well at higher ISOs. You also need a shutter speed that's going to do what you want with motion. Lots of stuff here. So my suggestion would be, at this point, you're not going to probably use your phone. It's unless you can literally be on the floor with the basketball players and following them around, you probably don't have the reach. You're going to have lots of background distractions with the lenses in your phone. Plus, in low light, there's just going to be a lot of noise, and it can be a lot of blurry motion because these phones don't perform as well in low light as a camera will. So, camera in hand, let's assume you have a camera in hand. My suggestion would be, if you're going to use auto exposure mode, be in shutter priority, and probably be around 1/125, 1/250 of a second. That's going to give you a chance to freeze the motion. If the players are moving, my suggestion would be to then learn panning, which is where you follow the motion and you're just letting the camera click, 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 take a bunch of photos. So the background will go blurry in that because you're moving the camera, but since you're following the movement of the subject, they will be relatively sharp. Practice again. There's that word, practice. There's really no getting around it. You have to practice these techniques so it becomes the way you see the motion, the way you see with your camera. So panning, relatively fast shutter speed, having a camera that can perform well in low light, those are my suggestions for doing indoor basketball photography. Next question is about creating photos of snow. Snow is tricky because it's super high contrast. It's very, very bright. It's going to reflect a ton of light, so your exposure is going to be potentially off by a little bit or a whole lot. Plus, that light tends to be very blue. You wonder, why does my snow look blue? Because white balance. So suggestions are to go ahead and make the photo. If anything, while you're making the photo, I would underexpose a little bit using exposure compensation. So if your camera has an exposure compensation dial, go to maybe -1. If your phone does that, there's a question coming up about how to do this on a phone. I'll show you that in a second. Take the photo, review it, and see what the settings did and if it looks the way you want. For the color stuff, my suggestion would be you can correct that in software when you get back to your computer. So yeah, snow's tricky. Also, it's tricky because it's cold and it's wet, and you may be wearing gloves. So there's a lot of difficulty in creating photos when you're in the snow. But the cool thing about that is most of us don't make photos in the snow, so it becomes more interesting because there's not as many photos of that. Here's that question about changing exposure on your phones. Can you do it? The question is, can you change exposure on your phones? And the answer is yes. Here's how you do it on an iPhone. So on an iPhone, there's the back of my office. When you tap your screen on a phone, it brings up a yellow box, a yellow square, and there's a sun to the right of that. If you tap on the sun and pull down, it will make your photo darker. If you tap on the sun and push up, it's going to make the photo brighter. So you're not setting a specific exposure here. You're just doing what's called exposure compensation, where you're making the photo brighter or darker. Having said all that, there's a couple ways to specifically set exposure on your phone. That involves, on an iPhone at least, using an external app, because the built-in camera app won't do it. My recommendation is to use the Lightroom app. The Lightroom app has a camera module in it where you can go into the Pro mode, and then you have exposure. So you can set shutter speed, ISO, and as well as some other settings on your phone. There are also separate other apps for manual exposure on various phones. So yes, you can change exposure on your phone. Okay, last category. Here we go. Miscellaneous. So the first question is, why is photography so popular? And here is my answer. My answer is, I think photography is so popular because it's kind of magic. One of the things I think that's magic about photography is we freeze time with it. We pause the fast forward movement of time and we stop it. So that's kind of cool. Another thing I think that's kind of magical about photography is almost anybody can do it. We have the technology that makes it easy for just about anybody to create a photo, to freeze that time and capture something interesting. And then ultimately, though, I think one of the things that's most magical about photography is all the layers of ways that can be interesting in the process, from the process of being out and creating photos, just the activity of doing photography. Learning the technical side of things is kind of magical, and knowing how you can control light and color and composition. And then another thing that's magical is when you're out and you see something totally unexpected. There's something that happens that maybe has never happened before and maybe will never happen again, or at least it's never happened in that way and has never been photographed by you before. So it's unique, it's rare, it's different, it's something interesting. So I think that's why photography is so popular. Oh, here's another reason why I think photography is so popular, is because it's an art medium that is really easy to share and be appreciated by, again, just about everybody. So an example would be when I was doing graphic design and I made a logo, let's say, of an insurance company. Yeah, it's kind of cool and I liked it, but no one else really wants to see that. But photos of just about anything, people enjoy looking at those things. They enjoy knowing a little bit more about me through the photos I share. At least I think that's why. Since I live near Seattle, how should I protect my camera from the rain while taking photos? That's a really great question and really important, because water and electrical things don't mix very well. So it depends a little bit on what camera you're using. Most phones are pretty weather resistant, even so far as being submergible, at least modern phones within the past 3 or 4 years. Cameras are a little different story. This camera, my camera, the Fujifilm X-H2S, is weather resistant, which means it has gaskets and sealing so that I don't mind taking this in a little bit of rain. My companion when I do go in the rain is a microfiber cloth to wipe it down as soon as I can after making photos with this thing. So some cameras are more weather resistant. Some lenses are also more or less weather resistant. So check that a little bit. Um, Regardless, my suggestion would be to protect your camera as much as you can from water. So unless you're actively creating the photos, keep a camera maybe in a jacket or in the camera bag somewhere where it's not getting wet until you take it out to make photos. So yeah, just be aware. Even with weather-resistant cameras, though, I would be hesitant in certain situations to get it wet, just because I'm a little nervous about that. So your mileage will vary. Check with your camera manufacturer to see what its rating is for weather resistance, if it even has one, if it even talks about that. And if it doesn't, then I would be hesitant to get it wet. And then you'd have to protect it. Next question is, does your photography/photographer inspiration ever change? If so, why do you think it happens? And that's a really interesting question. I really like that question. Yes, I think it does change. So I know it's changed for me at different parts of my photography learning journey. I've looked to different resources for that. Certain photographers earlier that I don't really follow so much anymore because I've learned what I can from them and now moved on to others. Another thing that's changed, and I think why it changes, is because I'm a different person. I'm a different person than I was 5 years ago, 10, 15, 20, lots more years than that ago. So because I've changed as a person, my interests have changed. And, you know, it's hard to know what informs what. Have my interests changed because I've changed, or has I changed because my interests changed? But it doesn't really matter. Yeah, you change, you grow, you experience different things, and you appreciate different things or appreciate them differently. So yeah, that's just part, I think, of normal life. For me, it's been kind of evolutionary, little changes rather than one big jump from one thing to another. But again, your journey may be different, and that's cool and awesome. But yes, find inspiration from other sources, wherever they may be. As a photographer, I'm starting to learn more and more from movies, from cinematography, and learning about composition, noticing those things, noticing color and light and all that stuff. So yeah, there's always new sources to learn from and be inspired by and to evolve to incorporate into my work. Last question is, what is something you wished you have known before getting into photography? For me, the biggest thing would have been to understand how the technical works so that I can leverage it to be creative. So specifically around exposure, understanding how shutter speed, aperture, ISO work, how they work together, how they affect the photo. So especially when I was in high school and college, my photos were mostly that I liked were mostly lucky rather than because I actually knew what I was doing. It wasn't until much later in life, in fact, until right before I started teaching about 12 years ago, that I started understanding how those things worked, and it informed my photography and allowed me to have different ways to be creative with my photography with understanding the technical. Also understanding how composition works, how being intentional with composition and leveraging that so that it gives me the ability to create photos almost anytime I want with almost anything, because using composition is the thing I have always the most control of as a photographer, so that wherever I'm at, I can probably find an interesting photo by using composition and not necessarily have to wait for sunset or sunrise or a bald eagle to fly by or rainbows or amazing things. But I can find an interesting photo in the ordinary stuff that's all around us oftentimes. So learning that and learning the technical, those are things I wish I had learned earlier, but better late than never. So there's some questions, there's some answers, as I mentioned at the beginning. If you have information you'd like to add to any of this conversation or any other questions you might have or follow-ups to any of these questions, I'd invite that in the comments below. Look forward to having a conversation with you about all things photography or what to have for lunch. So I look forward to those questions and comments. Thank you so much. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Hope you've learned a thing or two, and I'm grateful for your participation in this process. So until we meet again in another video, stay safe, stay well, and have fun creating photos. Bye for now.